Welcome back, everyone. Let's get started with the next module, the main simulation. In this module, for each city block that we have, we'll be simulating buildings into place to align them to the roads. Let's have a look at what's involved. The main simulation is pretty much the core of the system. It is the system that takes the actual city block that we have, then takes one of the building clusters, overlays them, and then checks which buildings are too much. For example, everything that falls outside of the city block gets cut away, and whatever remains will at some point be simulated into place. It requires the prerequisites that we've built in the previous modules as inputs. Techniques that we're using are packing techniques. We'll be very careful with transferring the attributes. As we've seen in the previous module, it is important that the attributes we want the buildings to have stay on top of the points. At least they have to make it all the way to the end of the chain so that we can then instance upon the points correctly. We'll be using a number of grouping techniques. This is to figure out which buildings to cut away and which not. And we'll be doing a lot of simulation with packed primitives. So all these points, they kind of intertwine, and we have to be careful that we do it correctly. During the simulations, we'll only be using singular buildings or base segments, as we don't require the mid-sections or the tops for the towers, for example. We'll be adding those in a later module. The output of this module will be a point cloud. The point cloud, like I said, will contain all the data that we need, and then we can instance upon the point cloud the buildings that we want to have on them. The way we're going to do this is we're going to overlay the buildings on the city blocks, cut away the excess buildings, and align the remaining buildings to the block's edges. We save these out as a BGO and store them on disk somewhere, and this disk location gets stored into a file. We remove the geometry and only keep the points, and make sure that these points contain the attributes we want them to have, and we do that for each city block. So in our case, we had 70 city blocks, if I remember correctly. So we're going to run this process every city block again and again. And in the next module, when we will be creating the skyline, so we're going to be adding the mid and top sections of the buildings, of the taller buildings, we'll have a look at the disk file, or the file that contains all the disk locations for the city blocks, which will then allow us to pull all these blocks in at the click of a button rather than having to import them again. So it's going to be similar to the system we used to import the buildings, for example. Let's get started.